Welcome to everyone from around the world. Tervetuloa kaikille ympäri maailmaa. Välkommen till alla från hela världen. On behalf of Finlandia Foundation National, welcome. My name is Tommy Flanagan, and I am the Executive Director of the organization. Today, we are very glad to have you all with us for this very interesting presentation. Yes, about someone that most of you familiar with famous Finns might know, Alvar Aalto, but about a specific topic that you might not be aware of or not completely aware of. We're very lucky to have Dr. Sofia Singler with us today. She's an architect and architectural historian from Jyväskylä, Finland. She's trained as an architect at the University of Cambridge and the Yale School of Architecture. She practiced architecture in Boston with a focus on educational and industrial buildings before returning to England to undertake a PhD in architectural history. She's currently a fellow of Homerton College, Cambridge, where she teaches and researches modern architecture. Her first book, The Religious Architecture of Alvar, Aino and Elissa Aalto, will be published by Lund Humphreys in October of this year. And the research for that book was partially funded by a grant from the Finlandia Foundation National. So we're very happy to have her here to highlight her work and hopefully educate a little bit about her work as well. Also, a huge thanks to the Finlandia Foundation staff for helping put this program together, to Kath and Jessica. And I guess at this point, kiitos oikein paljon, Sofia, and the floor is yours. We'll be back after the presentation for a question and answer, but until then, enjoy the presentation.
Kiitos oikein paljon, Tommy. Hi, everyone. It's fantastic to be here. Give me 2 seconds so I can share my screen. And you guys can let me know if this works or not. Tommy, can you give me a thumbs up or someone else just to let me, okay, fantastic. Okay, excellent. That means we're all set. Well, good afternoon or good evening or good night, depending on where you are, I suppose. I'm currently in Kainuu in northern Finland, which means it's past 10 p.m. here, but that also means because it's June, the sun is shining, it's nice and light and lovely outside. It's a tremendous honor to be able to share some of my research with you all this evening, so thanks so much for being here. Special thanks are due, of course, to Finlandia Foundation National, not just for hosting this event, but for sponsoring some of the research financially. And also to Kirk Gassinger, who's an architect and now friend whom I look up to a lot, and who in fact invited me to join this project in the first place. There's more on that later in this presentation. But what I want to do right now this evening with you all is to share with you the story of how 2 original drawings by the architect Alvar Aalto were found a few years ago after being presumed missing for decades. And I want to try and open up some perspectives into what this discovery tells us about Aalto's relationship to the United States and to the conception of the sacred and what that means for modern architecture. Before we get going, I want to begin by saying that Aalto is not just the name of a singular individual, but in fact, it's a label for a collective design studio. So when we use the term Aalto, we typically refer not just to Alvar Aalto, but to co-directors of the firm, Aino and Elissa Aalto. So Alvar's 2 wives, I should say consecutive rather than concurrent, as well as a number of employees, trainees, interns, contractors, collaborators, and indeed in some cases, even clients. So it's just a small note to say we should be mindful that more often than not, Aalto refers to a design collective. It's a kind of company and a design collective rather than a single individual. In the case of the Brooklyn project, 2 key individuals that I think deserve to be mentioned alongside Alvar are Aino Aalto, Aalto's first wife, who was co-director of the firm at this time in the 1940s, although she wasn't directly involved with the Brooklyn project per se, but she was co-director, so she counts. And then also Veli Paatela, who was the staff architect who was tasked with dealing with this project when Aalto was away on other construction sites or traveling somewhere else. I'm assuming most of us already know something about Aalto. Basically, if you're into architecture, specifically modern architecture, or indeed Finland at all, you're bound to know kind of what we're talking about. The portfolio of architecture, design, and urbanism that was produced by Alvar Aalto Associates Limited is vast. So this was an incredibly prolific design practice with hundreds of built projects all over the world. The total number of projects kind of depends on the criteria used to count, but the overarching consensus seems to be that it's around 200 to 300 projects that were realized, with an additional 300 or so projects that were left unbuilt. So they were designed fully, but then unrealized due to budgetary concerns or other issues that often plague architecture. Of this vast portfolio, 7 projects were for churches that were realized, that is. 4 of the realized churches are in Finland, 2 are in Germany, and 1 is in Italy. The Italian one being the only Catholic exception to an otherwise Lutheran group of commissions. One of these was built in the 1920s, so the practice's early years, as it were, and all the rest were built after the Second World War, during the massive European church building boom. Perhaps you will have visited some of these yourself. Of these 7 churches, it's the Church of the Three Crosses in Imatra, Eastern Finland, that's by far the most acclaimed. So as soon as it was finished up, construction-wise and consecrated and open to the public in 1958, it was received both in Finland and abroad as a kind of singular architectural achievement. I'm borrowing the words of the architectural historian Alan Colquhoun when I say, and he writes, where is it? It was the ultimate proof of Aalto's unparalleled ability to convert a 2-dimensional floor plan into a totalizing 3-dimensional plasticity, end quote. So the point is, this was something that was remarkably different from anything that had come before, both in Aalto's own portfolio and in Finnish church building more generally. So it's a very famous project. It's a project that's so famous that it plays cameos in all major narratives of the history of modern architecture. What we're looking at here are some of the most famous books on the history of modern architecture. These are books that are still read by students of modern architecture worldwide. And all of these books discuss Aalto's Church of the Three Crosses. And all of the authors have slightly different interpretations, but they all qualify the project as I suppose, the ultimate climax of Aalto's sacred architecture, if you will, not least because it was a direct commission rather than a competition submission, which in other words, granted Aalto with an unusual degree of design freedom and control. So this is all fantastic, right? Finnish architecture is on the world stage. Alvar Aalto is being discussed in all these books and subsequent historical narratives as a grand master of modern architecture, alongside super famous names like Mies van der Rohe, Le Corbusier, and Frank Lloyd Wright. But this focus on the Church of the Three Crosses and the other 6 realized churches has also obscured our understanding of those churches that were left unbuilt. So in addition to the 7 churches that were completed, the studio also produced projects for around, well, actually more than a dozen unrealized religious projects. Most of these were early career schemes from the 20s and 30s that were designed in the classical style. These were predominantly competition submissions, which were then losing entries, so they weren't built. And in addition to these full schemes for new build churches, the studio also worked on a number of renovation and conservation schemes of older churches. So things like fixing up the odd bell tower or adding a porch to another church, something like that. Then there's also a handful of unrealized religious projects from the later decades of the Aalto portfolio, including particularly very famous schemes for cemeteries and funerary chapels. There's even a kind of ghosted project from the very late years of the practice's operations for a mosque in Saudi Arabia. It was part of a much bigger urban design scheme, but we know very little about it. But nonetheless, these are all the unrealized religious projects. And of course, we know less about these projects because they were left unrealized. But we do know something about them because drawings survive. Archival drawings and other materials tell us what these projects could have been like had they worked out. Until recently, there was one project that we didn't know anything about. So it's Little Square in the 1940s, simply because no drawing records whatsoever existed. This is a very mysterious project for a church facade in Finntown, Brooklyn. And the only thing that we knew was that it was designed in the 1940s, but we had no other traces of it. This was a project that was listed in catalogs of all those works, including this authoritative listing of all the projects ever, shown here to the left, which was put together by Aalto's biographer, Göran Schild. But in these catalogs, the project was also was always just described as missing or unknown. Quite tellingly, I think the Brooklyn project didn't even warrant a footnote in the complete account of all those American years in this book called Aalto and America. These are both fantastic books, which I recommend to anyone who's interested in Aalto. For the audience here this evening, Aalto and America in particular, I think is a great and hugely enlightening read. It offers a very sage account of all those American years. It's truly a tremendous book. So I don't blame it, but since no materials related to the Brooklyn project existed, it makes no reference to the Brooklyn church whatsoever. Aino and Alvar Aalto first visited the United States in 1938 when their work was exhibited at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And this was a trip that also doubled as a site visit for their jointly designed finished pavilion for the New York World's Fair that we're looking at here, which opened up to the public in 1939. And soon after, in 1940, MIT invited Aalto to lecture and then ultimately appointed him visiting professor of architecture. His scholarly activity in Massachusetts definitely raised some eyebrows back home in Finland. And this was because his fiercest critics accused him of abandoning Finland during the war. They accused him of being a coward who somehow fled to the safe shores of America. I think it's worth noting, though, that at this time he was more than 40 years of age, which means that he would have been too old for the front anyway. But nonetheless, it's just to show that his time in America was quite contentious. But the way Aalto himself saw it was that MIT offered him the opportunity to serve his country through design, primarily by funding his research into standardization. So the research he conducted at MIT focused on methods of standardization and prefabrication, especially in timber construction. And this is research that Aalto had started himself in the 1930s in Finland, but then expanded and deepened during his MIT years, ultimately culminating into a plan to house war veterans and their families in prefab houses in Finland. One of the key outputs of his time at MIT was a speculative scheme we're looking at here called An American Town in Finland, which was an effort to explore how American urban planning paradigms could help Finland develop from being an only semi-industrialized to a fully modern industrialized society. And between 1945 and 1948, Aalto spent 7 long stints in the US for his teaching and research commitments at MIT. So we knew that the Brooklyn project had something to do with these years. This is where we were able to date it. But again, because no record survived, it was a bit of a blind spot in the historical narrative. So then let's fast forward from the 1940s to 2020. I had just finished my PhD on all those 7 realized churches. And at the time, during the pandemic, I was working on expanding this research into a book when I received this email. It was the most amazing thing for a researcher to receive out of the blue. I know this is too late and it's sort of out of the blue, but due to your interest in churches and especially Aalto, you might be interested in the info I have regarding a church he designed in Brooklyn, 1947. Let me know if you have an interest in corresponding more on this. Well, yes, please was the obvious answer for sure. This was an inquiry from an architect in Kansas City, Missouri, called Kirk Gassinger, who, as I eventually learned, had come into possession of a set of all the original drawings through a friend of his in Brooklyn. And I want to take this opportunity actually for a slight detour just to thank Kirk publicly, because scholars can sometimes be notoriously secretive. They're often worried that a competing academic might publish first. So there's definitely a sense of preciousness and ownership that surrounds important discoveries, which often makes academics hesitant to share an important new material. And I'm really, really touched and grateful that Kirk got in touch so openly and so non-hierarchically. Despite him having decades of experience in architecture, he got in touch with a young scholar in full trust, seemingly without any kinds of concerns about sharing these kinds of amazing materials with a complete stranger. I suppose there's something almost very Finnish about his trust in strangers, you could say. And this is the material that Kirk shared with me. These are two original drawings for a church facade in Finntown, Brooklyn, that indeed were signed by none other than the architect Alvar Aalto. Kirk's friend Chris Hilila had discovered these drawings among the personal files of her late father, the Reverend Bernhard Hilila. He was a third-generation American of Finnish descent who served as the spiritual shepherd of the Finnish congregation in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, which was an immigrant enclave of Finns known as Finntown. Oh yeah, and actually, first things first, before we could do anything much, the drawings had to be cleaned up. So Kirk hired a professional conservator to repair the drawings and to resurrect them into the clean, blue, bright, legible drawings that they are today. I suppose it makes sense that, having been stuffed away in a basement for more than 70 years, they definitely needed a bit of cleaning and flattening. As you can tell, they were quite dark, almost illegible to begin with. And while Kirk took charge of the conservation effort, I traveled to my home city, Jyväskylä, Finland, to do some digging in the Alvar Aalto archives. And there I was able to locate more written records, so things like handwritten project notes and telegrams that helped elucidate what had happened. And slowly the story started to unravel. So this is the church that Reverend Hilila and his congregation worshipped in. It was a building from the early years of the 20th century, complete with a decent, but I'd say architecturally fairly unremarkable Greek revival facade. I'm thankful to Robert Sosta, who I think is here tonight, in fact, for providing this photograph. I've never met him, but he had kindly shared this photo with the Finlandia Foundation staff. So this element of teamwork among strangers still continues here as well. So thank you very much. What happened is that then in March 1947, a fire severely damaged this church in Finntown, and in fact destroyed the whole facade. This was one of two large clusters of Finnish immigrants in New York City that went by the name of Finntown at the time. So the other Finntown was in Harlem. Now, Reverend Hilila was aware that his compatriot Alvar Aalto was teaching at MIT, so not too far away. And the Reverend wrote to him directly, quite confidently, asking for help. Would you, as a famous architect, come to help us? We're a community of displaced Finns in Brooklyn, and you're not too far away. So why don't you come help us out, please? Aalto accepted the commission, but he struggled to find time to work on it because he was so busy at MIT. Perhaps it was a mix of patriotic feeling and opportunism that made it difficult for Aalto to turn down the project. First of all, he didn't like turning down projects, even when he was overwhelmed by them. There's definitely a sense of professional opportunism there for sure. But second, he was a proud Finn. He was culturally a proud Finn for sure, but he was also very close to governmental figures. He carried an important role in Finland's reconstruction program. And in general, I'd say he considered it an honor for sure to represent his country abroad, despite the fact that he was very internationally minded and cosmopolitan as a character. So Finland was important to him, and I'd say that the fact that this was a Finnish congregation needing assistance presumably mattered a lot. This is the location of the church in Sunset Park in Brooklyn. And I think this patriotism theory, if you will, is strengthened by the fact that Aalto personally relinquished his design fee for this project. And he suggested that staff architect Veli Paatela, who was put on the project as kind of project supervisor, would only accept half of what he was actually due. Veli and Alvar then ended up hiring the Boston-born architect Robert Woods Kennedy, who was originally a teaching colleague of Aalto's at MIT, to provide his professional seal and signature for the design drawings, which is something that Aalto couldn't do because he wasn't registered in the US. And similarly, they told Robert Kennedy, you just have to accept a nominal sum, the least possible. So I think it's fair to say that this was a charity project of sorts. Some of the most interesting and definitely funniest materials are the telegrams. Turns out that Aalto was quite difficult to get hold of. He was rather bohemian in his ways, often ignored communications, got distracted and busy doing other things. And as you can sense from the tone of this telegram, the parish made repeated attempts to try and invite him to relevant council meetings, but he was a consistent no-show. We've been expecting you at church valtuusto, the Finnish word for church council. We can meet with you at your convenience tonight or tomorrow, but he never showed up. And he eventually wrote back very apologetically. He blamed his own unresponsiveness on his busyness at MIT. And of course, this is a legitimate excuse considering how busy he was there. He was designing a major dormitory for them. He was doing a lot of research, he was teaching. But I also managed to find from the archives a letter in which Aalto quite sheepishly admits to his project architect that actually he forgot the initial sketches in a random hotel room in Boston. So he needed to start all over. Nonetheless, despite all this chaos, Aalto managed to produce a draft for the finished church within 10 weeks of the initial fire. And this is the design that he came up with. So it's a perspective that we're looking at, and you might wonder, where's the rest of the project? You know, we're looking at an architectural scheme, so where are the sections? Where are the plans, most importantly? Well, these fell outside the project scope because the parish only commissioned Aalto to design the new facade. This is quite simply because the rest of the building survived the fire. And this commission for a single facade, you know, only a foot or two deep, was definitely a far cry from the grand commissions that Aalto was used to. And from the get-go, he felt very frustrated with this project for that very reason. You know, he's trying to figure out how to make an architectural contribution on such a thin plane, quite literally. There's one letter, again, from the archives in which he writes, and I quote him, "This matter is just not so simple." That was his impression of the project. Now, if we study the front elevation, we notice that the facade is essentially one large-scale trellis. It's draped in vegetation all over. It's asymmetrical. There's a cross in the middle, and there's a standalone sculptural figure to the top right if you look close. This is a sculpture that Aalto didn't design himself, but he was actually just drawing it in as a placeholder. He reserved space for Finnish sculptors working in San Francisco, in New York City, and he urged the parish to hire them instead. So this is evidence of kind of strong Finnish immigrant networks, you know, all supporting one another and passing off interesting commissions and jobs from various clients to one another. The first hunch that Kirk and I had was that this was a very simple masonry facade. It makes sense given the immediate context in Sunset Park in Brooklyn, lots of red brick over there. And it also makes sense in light of Aalto's own career because he became famous in the 1940s for his so-called red brick period. So we thought this might be the same thing, a kind of continuation of the same motif, if you will. But then again, from the archives, I found Aalto's written project description. And at that point, we realized that we hadn't understood the drawings correctly. We hadn't appreciated the fact that the red brick was to be slammed, which is a Finnish term for a type of kind of white plastering that you put on top of brick. We call it slammos. So it says, where is it? Tämä seinä slammataan in the project description. So this kind of white plastering leaves a really beautifully rugged surface to the wall. So in other words, what we thought was a red brick plane was actually white. And then we also learned that the trellis in front was going to be timber, but coated in very dark copper sheets. So our impression of the design changed quite a lot. Here's Kirk's kind of colorized sketch of what it would have looked like. The project now seemed to be more about establishing contrast to its surroundings rather than conforming to it. And this impression is fortified by how decidedly non-residential the design is. You know, it really seems to underscore the fact that this is a facade that veils something that is completely and consciously different from everything else that surrounds it. The absence of windows, I'd say, is particularly important here because there are a lot of bay windows on the street. So the fact that there's a windowless facade immediately signifies that we're standing in front of something quite different. It's tempting to think of the dominance, the visual dominance of the grid on the facade as a kind of tongue-in-cheek reference to the Renaissance revivals in the neighborhood, you know, the Renaissance being all about grids in some ways. So what Aalto's doing in this project isn't just using a mathematical grid as a kind of compositional baseline, but he's making the grid the design in and of itself. But of course, the real standout in the project isn't just the white slammed masonry and not even the trellis itself, I'd say, but of course the vegetation that hangs off of it. The Brooklyn facade was a small-scale experiment for the Baker House Dormitory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, which Aalto was designing concurrently. Similarly there, he was suggesting a big masonry facade that would be draped in vegetation. It's very common for Aalto to test out certain kind of design motifs and elements in different concurrent projects. And this itself, I'd say, is interesting because in a way, it links Brooklyn to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and vice versa, although the projects officially had nothing to do with one another. But I do want to note here that it's important to be wary of the dangers of overinterpretation. It's of course absolutely fantastic to find new drawings, particularly ones that Aalto's own biographer, Göran Schild, listed as missing. There's always scholarly satisfaction and thrill in finding something that was presumed long lost, of course. But we also have to recognize that these are just two drawings. You know, interesting additions as they may be to the collection of surviving Aalto originals, they're just a tiny, tiny fragment in a family of literally hundreds of thousands of preserved drawings from the studio's history. So it'd be remiss to paint kind of broad brush conclusions based off of just two drawings. If there are any architects in the audience, you'll know that we produce a lot of material when we design. Design is a messy, nonlinear process. So interpreting working sketches as definitive statements is a minefield. We definitely don't want to go there. So Kirk and I acknowledged that this discovery was more like figuring out two missing letters in a crossword puzzle rather than solving the puzzle in its entirety. Nonetheless, the project does suggest something. The moment you have material, you have something, and you can always say something about something. Interpretations can be drawn, particularly because we can study this project in light of his realized and other unrealized schemes, even if we have to limit the depth or width of these conclusions to some extent. So what does this project tell us about Aalto's time in America, or indeed his understanding of sacred space? I'd like to highlight three things in particular. And the first is the urban context. So again, it's very important that Aalto didn't seek to blend the facade in with its context. He wanted it to stand out. Where you had windows, he gave you no windows. Where you had red brick, he gave you slammed white brick. Where you had some curvature, different geometries from the bay windows, he gave you a flat grid. Now, this may seem like an obvious thing to do with a ceremonially important building like a church, but at the time, many church officials and theologians were urging architects to do exactly the opposite. So the idea in the 1940s was that the church should seek to humble itself, both physically and metaphorically, and it should literally, through architecture, try and blend in with everyday life. You know, standing out was seen as quite ostentatious, particularly in light of the World War. Nonetheless, Aalto insisted, both in Brooklyn and his sacred projects elsewhere. So if we start to consider the Brooklyn facade in light of his other churches, we're left with this impression that this is a very fundamental premise in all of his religious designs. The sacred needs to somehow be distinguished from the profane. It needs to be bounded off from the rest of the world. It needs to somehow be set into its own sphere. If you blend in the sacred too much with the everyday, it stops being sacred, simply put, which is why it deserves to be treated as hierarchically different from everything that surrounds it. And again, the same attitude is apparent from his realized churches as well. The Church of the Three Crosses in Imatra is a fantastic example. The altar area of the nave was always of particular importance to Aalto. So in the post-war era, it became very common to start designing movable altar tables, setting altars on the same level as the congregation in line with liturgical reformist ideas. So there's this widespread ambition to try and downplay the importance, the hierarchical importance of the altar inside the nave. You wanted to get rid of any sense of kind of ritual intensity. But Aalto absolutely declined that. So in Imatra, the parish said, listen, we can't have this kind of ostentatious, fancy nave. Let's go for a multi-purpose space. It'll come across as nice and humble. They said, actually, we should probably make it a sequence of different kinds of halls. So you could play basketball in one space, you know, have a prayer meeting in the other. This is what can avoid the problem of coming across as a bit too much. Aalto agreed, actually, but he very cleverly subverted the parish's hopes of a multi-purpose space by coming up with this sequence of 3 adjoined halls that actually end up magnifying rather than downplaying any sense of ritual intensity. So he creates a very strong gradient from the main entrance all the way to the altar, which actually makes it more rather than less theatrical. The second point I want to make relates to Aalto's approach to standardization, regularity, and again, the grid as a kind of fundamental premise in modern architecture. Regular design, standardization, this is something that he learned a lot about in the US, but also Germany. When he started working at MIT, there was much research that was being done there on standardization and modularization. And he was very invested in contributing to this research himself. He was exploring how to make architecture more efficient in light of wartime material shortages and pressures to mechanize building systems. So here are some snippets of some of his standardization work at MIT. And essentially he was doing this kind of work just to figure out how Finland could rebuild as efficiently as possible after the war. He was hugely interested in and supportive of standardization, but he was very concerned that standardization was becoming too dogmatic. His view was that human life was simply too complicated, too rich, too humane in many ways, too fragile to be squeezed into regularized frames. So introducing an element of variance and joy to an otherwise regular system was important to him. And this is what he's implying when he drapes the regular facade, grid, and vegetation, and when he makes it asymmetrical. This is something that he does in the Brooklyn facade, but also Baker House at MIT, and indeed many other projects as well. So there's the sense that the grid is literally and metaphorically the starting point of design, but its regularity is then subjected to the joys of diversity and variance through asymmetry and above all through vegetation. And this is something that he does, again, in all kinds of commissions, perhaps most famously in private villas. This example is Villa Kokkonen from Järvenpää. And nature is my third and final point, or more specifically, I suppose, nature in relation to sacred space. From the 1930s to the 1950s, pantheism was in vogue among Finnish modernists. I'm sure the audience at a Finlandia Foundation event are intimately familiar with the importance that's accorded to nature in Finnish culture. This has always been the case and still is today. But in the first half of the 20th century, nature became particularly significant, not just as a cultural historical idea, but as a theological conception. So many modernists started to suggest that God was nature, and conversely, that nature was God. Be it in painting, poetry, sculpture, architecture, many modernists started exploring these ideas at this time. One of the most famous examples from the sphere of architecture specifically is the Resurrection Chapel in Turku by Erik Brygman. As you can see, it quite literally invites nature inside the church. It's filled with vines, plants, floral ornamentation, and it opens up to a forested view with generous natural light flowing in. Another example is more minimalistic, but just as poignant, Heikki Kaija Siren's chapel in Otaniemi, Espoo, which goes as far as to substitute a traditional piece of sculpture, a painted altarpiece with a cross that is set inside the forest beyond the building boundary, which means that the trees are part of the altar. So the design in essence seems to suggest that the sacred can be found in the forest, or perhaps even that the forest itself is sacred. As significant as nature was to Aalto, you'll be surprised to hear that his religious projects decidedly block off nature from the church interior. While his residential and civic commissions quite often invite nature inside, his churches generally don't. So the absence of any kind of plantings or other natural elements in these interiors is immediately noticeable. And in many ways, the Brooklyn project supports this view. Nature is drooped on the grid. It flows all over outside the building, but it's not invited inside. There's no windows, so he allows for no natural light to come inside. You wouldn't be able to see any of the vegetation that was drooped on the grid if you were inside worshiping, which seems to me to be a direct commentary. Nature is beautiful, but it's not God per se. We can't sacralize that in lieu of a personified God. It's not entirely certain why this design was left unrealized, though presumably finances are to blame. We have some fragmented accounts of the parish's history that suggest that despite the fact that Aalto and his collaborators were giving very heavy discounts, still the final price was simply out of reach for a very small immigrant congregation, which then resulted in the rejection of Aalto's design. So instead, the church council hired a very newly established firm called Katz and Weissman Architects, whose co-founder, Thina Weissman, was one of the first women to graduate from the Pratt School of Architecture. And she was also the daughter of one of the parishioners. So Weissman and her husband, Sidney Katz, devise a very simple red brick facade. As you see here, it's symmetrical. It's just punctured in the middle by a rose window and has this whitewashed cross to the top right. And this is what still stands today. The church still serves an immigrant population today, but it's a Hispanic rather than Nordic congregation, and it professes Catholic rather than Lutheran dogma. So in the interest of time, I think I'll wrap up here, but I did want to point you to further reading if you're interested in learning more. What I've briefly just run through is kind of the simplified version of the story. Kirk and I co-authored a piece for the New York Review of Architecture, issue number 25, which outlines the discovery of these drawings and kind of lays the groundwork for further analysis. And then you can read more about not just Brooklyn, but about Aalto's religious architecture more generally from my upcoming book, which Tommy mentioned earlier, which will be published by Lund Humphreys this October. It's available for pre-order right now. And here's an excerpt from the chapter that addresses the Brooklyn project specifically. And before we open up for questions and discussion, again, I just wanted to express my sincerest thanks also to the children of Reverend Hilla, who saved these drawings, who recognized that there was something important in these drawings and brought these drawings to Kirk's attention. Thanks also to the Alvar Aalto Foundation for their very generous patience and assistance in trawling through the museum archives in search of additional material that helped shed some light on the additional details in the story. And again, to Kirk for getting in touch in the first place, for trusting me with the analysis of these drawings. And finally, Finlandia Foundation National for hosting this evening. And above all, for so generously supporting financially this research and this book. I really mean it when I say that without a Finlandia grant, this book simply would not have been possible to write. So I remain deeply indebted and grateful for all your assistance and support. Thank you very much. Thanks, guys. I guess we'll open up for questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sofia. You can see my virtual applause on my screen. That was certainly a fascinating deep dive into, something that probably most people don't know about. And that's it's always an interesting thing, I'm sure, you as a researcher, as an academic, when you're really making sort of a contribution, or you're able to bring together all of these pieces and make a contribution to something that's kind of new in the field. So I think that's great that we all kind of got to be here to witness that. And obviously we're glad that you've been able to make such great use of the grant, and glad that you applied, and very interested to see where you go next. So I guess that would be my first question, to maybe just open it up here. What is next with this, right? You've kind of brought it to this very logical and nice sort of conclusion for the presentation today, but what questions are sort of still on your mind of like, what comes next with this?
Thanks, Tommy, for the question. I think the Brooklyn project for now is somewhat wrapped up. Going back to the point on, we have to recognize the scope of these are only 2 drawings in a family of literally tens of thousands of drawings if you look at all the religious projects together. And I'd even say that I'd even go as far as to say that the historical research is kind of wrapping up to an end of sorts. I feel like we now have enough information on the story of all of these buildings, both realized and unrealized, but what matters now is their afterlife, as I call it. So what happens to these buildings after construction? In an age of dwindling parish attendance and very poor finances, most of these churches now face a pretty terrible fate. They're they're crumbling. They're not in good shape at all. And the fate of the Church of the Three Crosses is particularly consequential. It's one of 13 Alvar Aalto designed buildings that is listed in Finland's current tentative UNESCO World Heritage Site application. And so it's bringing up very interesting questions on what do we do? You know, that the parish owns the building and it's their responsibility to take care of it, but they simply don't have the means to. So it's questions on kind of conservation and heritage, and yeah, I suppose that the afterlife of the churches, more generally speaking, that my current research is pivoting towards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting, and it's always nice when you kind of come. I mean, and it's an academic sort of historical architectural work you've done, and then bringing it potentially to a project that's very contemporary and sort of action oriented to do something. And certainly that's what organizations like Finlandia Foundation are really interested in, that kind of work too. So it'll be interesting to see, you know, what comes of this. We got one comment in the chat here from Cheryl, who mentioned that, you know, she is in Michigan and was aware that there was a Finnish population there, of course, for our American audience, but was unaware that in Brooklyn there was such a Finnish population. And of course, we have someone here who's quite knowledgeable about that population. Robert Sass is with us. So I don't know if we could maybe give him an opportunity at this point. Do you have a question or something you wanted to maybe address at this point, Robert, if you'd like to? You're muted. I'm going to have to ask you to unmute. You might need to click on the bottom of your screen. There you go.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, great. Well, just to let some of you know that I've been very involved in getting plaques on over 27 buildings surrounding Sunset Park, there were over 30 buildings that were built by the Finns surrounding Sunset Park. And they were the first co-ops brought to the United States, which is something that I don't think anybody knew. And the very first building was Aalto 1 and then Aalto 2. Aalto 1 was built in 1916, and it got historical designation by the Department of the Interior, which is the United States, and also by New York State, and recognized as the first not-for-profit co-op brought to the United States. There were a few co-ops that were actually for profit that were built before, but these were the first not-for-profit. And these were built by these were all 4-story buildings, 4 apartments on the floor, spacious apartments, particularly in those days. You're talking, I think, 9-foot ceilings. If you go to Lower Manhattan and you go to the tenement museums for the early 1900s, it was horrible living back then. And they built these co-ops for themselves, and they brought the concept of co-op ownership to the United States. Everybody chipped in, either money or work, and you got one share or one co-op apartment, and that's how they did it. They were all carpenters. My grandfather was a carpenter. He came here in the 1920s, and they all joined the Carpenters Union, and they were all carpenters, and they decided to build buildings for themselves. Why should they build it for someone else? They can build it for themselves. And they did. The buildings, co-ops today go from anywhere from 400 to 800,000. It's amazing. They were so well built. I see Conrad Gartz is on the line there. He's in one of the Brooklyn co-ops, was very helpful in getting the plaques on the walls. And basically, all of these plaques, they're bronze plaques, and they say, this is to commemorate or honor this building is one of the more than 30 Finnish co-ops that were either built or converted to co-ops by the Finns who came here in the early 1900s and brought the concept of co-op ownership to the United States. Many of them had nicknames like Gerhantalo, poorhouse. They gave that house the name because there were people who were living there who were more well-to-do. So it was sort of like a dig that there's the poorhouse over there. The building that Conrad lives in had 2 names. It was called Finntown, meaning the long house, because it was so long, it was so big. It was also called Hikipisara, which means drop of sweat, because it took a lot of sweat to build that big building. That's probably the biggest building there. It consists of 6 buildings. Most of these buildings all surrounded a courtyard, and a lot of them have, well, Hikipisara had 6 buildings. A lot of them have 4 buildings. There are also single buildings. One of those single buildings, the most fascinating part that I got today, is called the Olga Goski House. And nobody knows who Olga Goski is. And there you showed up on the screen a telegram that was signed by Olga Goski. I immediately took a picture of it. I'd like you to send a copy of it to me if you could. And I mean, that's the first clue as to who this woman is. And of course, people always ask me, who was she? I have no clue. And there's nothing in the written material that I have that indicates who it is, who it reckons. So maybe that's a clue. I now know that obviously she was a member of the Gloria Dei Church. And incidentally, I went to Sunday school at the Gloria Dei Church. So if you have any questions, I mean, it's, one thing that I would like all of you to know, that I am in the middle of a project with a company in Finland called City Nomadic. And we are creating a website where you can click on any of the buildings or any of the businesses, the churches, the Imacha Hall, and you can get pictures of all these buildings, and you can do literally your own tour of what was once Finntown. And we hope to get that publicized so that theoretically tourists, Finns coming to New York City, have an option to actually do a tour of Finntown. Or you can do a tour of Finntown just by going on the website. That's going to be coming up very shortly. I think within a month, we'll have the first version up.
That's amazing. And it's such a compliment actually to what we're talking about here today. And I love the fact that there was a connection made, right, through Olga Koski. I don't know, Sofia, if you want to talk about that point at all, if you had anything to add about Olga.
I can just second the points made by Robert, which is that she seems a bit of a mysterious figure. I don't really know anything about her other than she was very active in anything and everything related to Finntown. So she shows up in the records as ostensibly a kind of parish active. She was the one who was in charge of trying to write to Alvar Aalto and trying to force him to actually get on site when he was getting distracted elsewhere. So she was very active for the cause of Finntown, if you will, but I've been able to locate very little biographical information on who she actually was as an individual.
The only other clue I have is that one of the originators of the Imacha Hall was a guy by the name of Goski. So it is possible that she's related to that original guy, but I have that's only speculation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have a question I'd like to ask Robert, because I'm from the West Coast, and I remember in 1948 traveling with my parents over to the East Coast, and we were in Brooklyn on Flatbush Street. Is that in the Finntown area at all?
No, Flatbush is an area of Brooklyn, I would say, going towards Long Island. Hey, if you got in the car and drove east towards Long Island, it would be about maybe 5-6 miles away. So it is close, but and there is a Flatbush Avenue, but it's not near. It doesn't go through Finntown.
Okay, because we did visit a Finnish woman in her apartment. I didn't know if perchance she was living in one of the co-ops, but I was very young at the time. So not knowing the geography of Brooklyn, that's why I asked the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. A lot of interesting points here and a lot of people kind of connecting dots, I think. There is another question in here in the chat, Sofia. I'll kind of abridge one of these. Someone actually recognizes you from something that went on at a breakfast in Jyväskylä here, but the question that they have is about entities, about one of your sort of conclusions about standardizations. Which entity or which entities have carried on the flexible standardization of Aalto's vision in recent years, in your opinion? So maybe expanding on that, or other examples of kind of your conclusion of standardization, if you could go off of that.
Thanks. I mean, most literally and directly, I would say Artek, you know, the design firm founded by Alvar Aalto, along with other people, including Aino Aalto, Nils Hall, Maira Gulliksen, various other people in the mid 1930s. Artek is still a company that is alive and well today. And they still very much live and breathe the original ethos of flexible standardization, for sure. And I'd like to think that their ongoing work on not just producing the same furniture kind of almost a century later, but above all, focusing on secondhand upcycling of Artek pieces in a way speaks to the same design philosophy at a fundamental level. So that's the kind of literal intellectual pedigree in some ways that never died out and is still going strong. And additionally, I can think of kind of less directly, but still quite powerfully, several contemporary Nordic design firms that practice today that very much work on similar themes. So I'd say as an idea, it hasn't really died out, but if anything, it's becoming increasingly urgent, not least due to the climate crisis. We need to figure out how to standardize how to build more efficiently. We all accept that now, but then this idea of how to standardize and how to modularize in a humane way still needs to be answered. So you'll actually see a lot of Aalto design philosophy cropping up in design debates and discourses today when we're trying to figure out how to use robots or AI or other digital fabrication technologies to try and standardize our building in the contemporary world. So I'd say the philosophy is alive and well. If anything, it's living a kind of renaissance, you could say. And it's also present in the kind of tangible design projects of several Nordic firms that I know of practicing today.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And a third question goes kind of with your third conclusion about nature, right? So we had standardization, but now about nature and how, you know, you've tied it to, you know, the religious buildings that Aalto and others were designing, but maybe you can talk a little. I mean, the question in the chat was, how did those Finns who thought nature being divine had a religious faith, how do they reconcile the two in their mind? So I think that's one question. My question, maybe you can talk about other examples of nature in Nordic design, religious or non-religious, but to keep going on that nature theme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would even go as far as to say that the kind of pantheist undercurrent in Finnish cultural thought and religious discourse hasn't entirely died away either. As we all know from, you know, mythologies of the sauna or swimming in the lake or the midnight sun, the summer solstice. These are ideas that have been popular and very strong in Finland since pagan times. Many of them were later Christianized, and many of these still live on today. When it comes to modernists trying to reconcile the idea of a kind of Trinitarian personified God and Christian dogma with nature, they didn't see any kind of conflict in there whatsoever. They saw the Bible as an interesting collection of religious narratives and kind of moral teachings. But there are a few bits of the Bible that they would quote in defense of their pantheist views. One is the Gospel of Luke. I'm now kind of butchering it because I'm translating from Finnish in my head, but there's a section in the Gospel of Luke where it's mentioned that God is neither here nor there, but he's already amongst you. He's somewhere. And so that's one of many biblical verses that these modernists would anchor themselves into as a way of saying, look, even the Bible says that actually God and godliness and the sacred as a concept is amongst our midst. And the way they interpreted that is that nature in and of itself is sacred.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is something that wasn't limited to architecture, but features in poetry. I can think of poets like Helvi Juvonen, who kind of mixes biblical imagery and metaphors with descriptions of the forest floor, kind of personifies lichens and mushrooms and mosses, kind of worshiping in the church that is the forest. Or indeed painters like Eero Järnefelt. He has these very famous paintings, kind of oil paintings of individual little flowers, which were then interpreted through a biblical lens as a way of saying, look, even this lone pond flower is worthy of pictorial representation. In a way, this at the time was seen as a Christian interpretation to say, so too, God loves even the poor, hopeless sinner. Mm-hmm. And so you might see yourself in the lone little flower in the forest around the lake.
Wow. Well, this also highlights how you really have to be an interdisciplinary thinker once you get to these conversations, right? This is the conversation that you're having on your own research is definitely in some ways as related to theology as it is to architecture, right? And I'm sure you've had to sort of become an expert on some of that stuff when maybe that's not what you originally started to study. But I think most academics feel that way, right? You get kind of pulled into the direction you have to go this way because it's all very inherently connected. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I wouldn't go as far as to call myself an expert, but I have to dabble in fields beyond architecture to make it all make sense, for sure. And to add to that, I would say that, linguistic barriers have played a huge role in the study of Alvar Aalto. So funny enough, the most famous Aalto scholars tend to be from Italy or the UK or the States with no understanding of Finnish culture or language. And when it comes to, his churches, for instance, all the prior analyses had said, well, Aalto's an atheist, at least publicly. So there's nothing more to these churches. We can't really interpret them in any deeper way. These were just opportunistic artistic experiments, very structurally, spatially interesting designs, but they didn't really have anything to do with religion. And this is because, the Englishman, gentlemanly scholar would come to Finland and take a photo and go home and write about it. Or the Italian would look through a journal and say, yeah, they look kind of funky. So I guess it's about formal experimentation. But no one had gone through the church archives because so few people speak Finnish and Swedish. And it's only once you go into the archives and you look at project notes and correspondence between Aalto and the bishops and the local priests that you start to understand, actually, there's a whole wealth of theological and religious discourse going on that these buildings address directly. Mm. And you might even go as far as to say that many of these buildings are kind of architectural or spatial metaphors for religious ideas, but we just hadn't understood them because we hadn't looked at them through the linguistic and cultural lens that is Finland.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's another strong testament to how important interdisciplinary sort of collaboration is in any of these questions, right? Whether it's linguistic and cultural understanding or theologic, religious, that's really interesting. Great. Okay, well then, thank you so much. We'll see you all later and hey.
Thank you. Kiitos ja näkemiin.
Näkemiin.